Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight on the all new podcast, A Storyteller's Power Hour. I'm really excited about this week's episode. This is honestly one of the biggest and largest, I think, topics that made me think that story was not just relevant, but bigger than anything else that I had ever experienced. The person that we're going to talk about tonight is Joseph Campbell. The idea and the concept that we're going to discuss is the hero's journey. Um, I'm going to get into what that is, give you some definitions, give you some ideas about how we use the hero's journey, and what ways we sort of look at things. But let me give you a little bit of background first. So, in order to understand the hero's journey as it is sort of written about, now, specifically, the hero's journey by itself is not a thing that is, let's say, an outline or a guide or even really a template. It's been used as a template before. Famously, Disney, for quite some time, sort of used the hero's journey as its guide for creating new stories. And it was interesting because I think they did some really good work with it, but I also think that they, like most people, lost track of what the hero's journey is really supposed to be about. So, Joseph Campbell, just so that we can get this out of the way, wrote extensively about the power of myth, and specifically the power of myth as it related to multicultural environments. That is not just the Western myth, but the Asian myths, not just the Slavic ideas of gods and goddesses, hearth goddesses, ideas of fairies in England, but also, the culture of uh, Shinto um, houses, the idea that there were many interpretations for all of the things that we put into story, they all had a place. And their place was not very far away from each other, just told enormously differently. But one thing sort of remained at the center, and that was this idea of the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey does not apply. Let's just get this straight right away, too. It doesn't apply to every single story that we necessarily think is a good story. Not every story needs to be the hero's journey as it sort of has its template like inception that we think of, right? Which is all of the different phases, which we'll get into about how the hero begins, what he sets out to do, how he's sort of tempted, what things happen to him along the way, how he ultimately, steals the fire from the god, and then how he goes back to his home village, realizes that he doesn't even fit there anymore, and then has to kind of figure out his next move in the world. Okay, but not every story fits that. So, good stories don't always work that way. But myth, real myth, tends to follow the cycle of the hero's journey. And so Joseph Campbell noticed this by basically reading everything under the sun that he could, which involved myth. He was the world's first sort of, well, not the world's first, but one of the world's best, I think, deconstructors of myth. And he realized that in most mythic stories that involve the hero doing something that then they walk away from the experience with something that is supposed to be a moral or a cautionary tale or a little bit of wisdom for us to use, that it all sort of fell into a very similar arc. And that arc, or the circle, became the hero's journey. Y- One thing that I think is really important to understand here, though, is that the hero's journey by itself doesn't explain anything. The hero's journey by itself is simply kind of like your guideposts, your off ramp exits. You're driving down the highway of your story and you see the call to adventure. And you can note it and you can say, hey, look, there's the call to adventure. And then you can be driving, and I know I'm speeding ahead, but maybe you'll see a threshold guardian and you'll can note that too and say, hey, there's a threshold guardian, but we're going to keep driving because we're not done with our story. None of these things are important on the destination other than to note them. That is, as you're telling a story, unless you are actually telling a mythic story that needs to have the hero's journey as its guide, there is absolutely nothing wrong with telling any kind of story that doesn't involve each one of these things. Now, generally, when you set out to write a story that has a mythic character involved, or a character that has mythic proportions, mythic uh, ideologies, that where you have a character that truly kind of encompasses what the truly heroic aspect of mythic character does, you can spot all of these different pieces. But it's confusing in today's day and age when we have a hero's journey that is used as if it is the template guide for a story, instead of looking at it like, here's a great way to reverse engineer whether or not a story is truly a mythic cycle or not. Does it have all of the aspects of the hero's journey? Then it probably is some kind of mythic story, or it involves mythic storytelling. And the reason, if we jump back to Disney, that it worked so well with Disney is because they were using, and still do use, a lot of fairy tale tropes where heroes and heroines oftentimes jump out of the pages of myth and legend. I mean, one of my favorite, I know it's not everybody's favorite, but one of my favorite Disney stories is Hercules. And the Hercules story runs a perfect hero's journey. It's a perfect circle. It works really well. But as Disney sort of moved into other kinds of storytelling, yeah, the hero's journey doesn't quite work after that. And Kanto, as an example, doesn't really follow a specific hero's journey, even if each one of the characters kind of has their own little mini hero's journeys arc. Yet, no, it kind of doesn't work because it's really fragmented. But that does not make Encanto a bad story, and it certainly doesn't make the story of everything that happens to the madrigals less important. So I wanted to start out by saying that, you know, there's a lot of ways to interpret what Joseph Campbell labeled the hero's journey, but it doesn't have to be the end all. And I just wanted to make sure that that was really clear right up front, because as we begin to talk more and more about what the hero's journey really is and why this is an important aspect of storytelling, we need to understand equally, with equal importance, what it's not. So let's move a little bit into why it is that Joseph Campbell noticed any of these things at all. So, like I said, Joseph Campbell has spent years and years and years and years just reading. I mean, he took off from his normal life, which was, he was an educator. He did a lot of things actually, but he, notably, as with many people who work in writing, they oftentimes begin as professors or have a career that is involved with education. And so he was surrounded by a lot of material. And he specifically wanted to understand how it was that stories that came out of India felt very similar to stories that came from the Middle Ages. What separated by time, separated by culture, separated by many things, why did they all feel as if they had some centralized thematic ideas in them? And it really kind of boiled down to, as you are telling the very important stories, you repeat these aspects because these are the aspects that you want your audience to understand. Um, so as I was understanding what Joseph Campbell was saying, and my first experience with Joseph Campbell was reading um, The Power of Myth, which is basically an interview with Joseph Campbell and this man named Bill Moyers. And it came from a PBS special where he asks questions and Joseph Campbell answers, and there's a lot of really interesting things that come out of that. And then they're extrapolated upon inside of the book with lots of different ideas about and examples about what it is that he's talking about. And so, one of the most interesting aspects of that book for me was understanding that there was no difference between the religious hero of one part of the world and the religious hero of the other part of the world. Which is not to say that ideologically they didn't have differences, because of course they did, but they fulfilled the same function, which was to give the people, give the populace, give the audience, the readers, something to understand, a message, a coded moral, a a little bit of hope that then became centralized and a part of a bigger story. And as I was reading this, something clicked in my head. I can't tell you exactly what it was, but something really clicked in my head. And before we get into the idea of whether Joseph Campbell was correct or incorrect about many other things, I'm going to say that for right now, we are simply talking about the hero's journey and how much sense the hero's journey makes sense when we are talking about deconstructing story. And then we'll talk a little bit about the construction of story using hero's journey as a template and why it often fails, and maybe a little bit of how you can use it to better a story. So as I was, like I said, as I was reading this, I came up with this like aha moment, and it made me want to research more and more about who Joseph Campbell was and what he had written. And I got absolutely obsessed, I think is really a good word. And the more that I read about what Joseph Campbell was saying, the more I sort of understood that the reason that I was so incredibly enraptured with this whole idea was because the ideas of Carl Jung were also intricately wound through his narrative about who the heroes were, what the myths were, why the mythic cycle was even important at all, and what we were gaining from the power of story. What does it all mean? Um and the more that I kept reading, the more it kept making sense, and the more I was jumping back and forth between things that Carl Jung had said and why I loved that, and why and how Joseph Campbell sort of used every man's everyday language to explain some of the more difficult and nuanced conversations, discussions, even debates, I think, about what it is that we are experiencing when we are reading story and how we connect to the audience as both writers and how readers connect to a story in the just the active part of reading. Now, one of the things that starts pretty early with Joseph Campbell is, he basically sets up the story like this. There's a storyteller, and the storyteller in in most of these sort of ideas is the storyteller that's telling the story to a group of people. So maybe a verbal oration, maybe, you know, the storyteller telling the story of the warrior, which tends to be the one that gets used the most, who has to leave the village. Maybe he's going to kill a lion. Maybe he's going to, understand what's happening with a foreign tribe. Maybe the water has disappeared. Who knows? But whatever it is, the hero has to be called out. And generally, the hero is someone who refuses in the beginning, right? He has this kind of humble, anyone but me, I can't possibly be your guy. There has to be some kind of refusal of the call, is what they call it. And I always thought that that was really interesting because why would anyone start out a story with the hero walking away from the whole adventure that you are asking your hero to basically engage in? And from a storytelling standpoint, it's really interesting to think that any one of our heroes would not be tempted by the just absolutely overwhelming sense of, hey, I'm going to go off and do these great things. But it is the sheer act of saying, no, maybe I'm not your person, that sets up the small little bit of doubt that the hero needs to have in order to both keep themselves humble and also to really be open to the lessons of the story, the lessons of the journey. Um, and the more that I kept reading about this, the more I kept putting myself into the position of, okay, so this is, not to put myself on the grand adventure because that's not specifically what I was trying to do, but I was trying to interpret everything, understand it through the lens of the hero's journey. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, well, what would my refusal be? What is it that I'm getting or not getting out of this? And I think part of this was actually a part of where I really began to understand that again, the hero's journey isn't set up for us to recreate as a this is the tried and true part of every story that has to exist. It's more like this is the part of the story where we, the readers, are clued in that there are certain things that are happening here which will make the story great down the road, which will, we get the clue with the refusal of the call that the hero has some humility, that he's humble, that he doesn't believe that he is the one. He's not, he doesn't start out as the special. Um, which more and more I keep using the special because honestly, the Lego movie makes me extremely happy from a storytelling standpoint. It is absolutely just a perfect kind of story to me. I just love it. So the special to me is absolutely, the hero, but the hero that the gods favor. And probably the hero who doesn't know that he's a hero. When you can identify that you are the hero of your own story, then you've generally moved on from that story. You're seeing it in retrospect. So you're not going to be able to identify it in the middle of it because there's just too much else going on. So, um, so the this idea that each part of the hero's journey had to be accomplished in order to make things make sense, I spent a lot of time struggling with that. And I kept reading more and more of Joseph Campbell. I kept trying to, you know, contemplate, well, what aspect of all of these things do all of these stories have and why can't I find them? And honestly, I kept trying to deconstruct different stories using this model and finding it very unfulfilling. Why can't I find all of these aspects? Where are they? I mean, the hero's journey by itself seems so incredibly well mapped out. Why do the stories that I love so much not reflect this, even though I absolutely know at the center that these are 100% what Joseph Campbell was talking about. And specifically, the myth stories that I loved the most. And, I grew up very much with Western culture in my heart. I grew up in the Northeast. So I was exposed to stories that were very much centered on Greek, Roman, stories that were in terms of the myth of King Arthur was huge. uh Myths in chivalry, myths that are grounded in chivalry, myths that sort of have the Western European flair. I didn't learn about the Eastern myths until I moved out here to Hawaii, and coincidentally, so did Joseph Campbell, long before I was here. But nevertheless, I feel like I was kind of following him. It was kind of weird. Um, in any event, when I moved out here, I realized that people were obviously telling stories. There's a lot of great Hawaiian myths and legends, which are phenomenal. And Moana, the Disney show Moana, sort of touches on some of them, because there are some shared ideas in Polynesian myths that they kind of get a little bit convoluted in our understanding of myth today, but they're there. And I was really interested to see if if I could figure out how those stories might fit into my understanding of the hero's journey, because the Greek and Roman myths, yeah, they sort of followed that. I could kind of get it. I could also see that there was a lot of hero's journey esque storytelling in the Bible, where we had a lot of informational, not just in the parables, but also in all of the sort of questing that happens in the Bible, ideas that, far exceed the value of just the story itself. They're absolutely phenomenal morality center points. And it was really fascinating. And then, like I said, when I moved out here, I started to realize that, there's a lot of Polynesian myths, there's a lot of even Buddhist stories that all center around this same exact idea. They I won't call them mirrors because they don't mirror each other. And they have very different functions. And the storytelling is obviously very different, but they serve the same exact purpose. And usually at the center is the hero, the person, the special, that is the one who gets all the information that we need and then imparts it to us. And it was honestly, I know maybe today this seems provincial in its understanding in the awakening of that knowledge. Maybe it feels like that's, wow, that's silly, but at the time, that was huge. That was absolutely a a big aspect of understanding that the correlation between cultures and the hero's journey was absolutely there, and all that you had to do was take a look at it. And then I started to look at some of the uh m- I guess, for lack of a better word, I'm gonna say, because this is big, and I feel like this is more contentious than anything else, right? Because the African continent is just absolutely an enormous place. And to add a single culture or a cultural idea as African is completely and totally erroneous. There are so many pockets of and subcultures in on the continent of Africa. And the countries that are there now, they their geographic boundaries, that we sort of drew, that kind of have a present day understanding. But if we go backwards in time, thousands of years, obviously none of those geographic boundaries existed. And we have all of these pockets of specialized geography where groups made their civilizations, where groups had their cultures, where nomadic people moved from place to place and they had their own culture and they all told their own stories. And so as I started to look at those, I began to think, well, okay, now we're really getting into, does this really work or does it fall apart? Is it even possible that the stories that come from Africa could possibly work? The answer is yes, actually, it really does work. Those stories, they have a different tempo, they have a different idea at the center, but they all work as the with the hero. Now, sometimes the hero in a story is the one who understands that the trickster is actually tricking them. Or sometimes the hero in the story is just the one who gets away from the trickster and can tell the story of the trickster to everyone else. And so the story itself isn't always centered around just one central protagonist. Sometimes the story is centered around whoever the trickster is, and then what happens to the people that enter into the sphere of that trickster. The reason that that's even important at all is because if we're looking at the context of the hero's journey, I think we have to sort of open up the lens of this a bit, keep the aperture very wide on it, and allow for a lot of different information to filter in. And once again, I go back to this idea that the hero's journey is not the template. The hero's journey is the template by which we look at the story as it was written to see where are these parts that we easily recognize and can easily sort of identify and be able to make sense in a deconstruction model from there, so that we can understand even stories that were not made for us, even stories that were not made for the Western culture to understand. Or if you're in the East, maybe you wouldn't understand the story of Anansi. Maybe if you were in in um, in I'm sorry, I just got stumbled on a word. But if you were, let's say you were in medieval England, maybe you wouldn't understand the story of Buddha, right? Because your culture is different, your religion is different. You're not going to be able to pick up on the subtle nuance of what the story is trying to tell you. But what Joseph Campbell did was basically say, okay, well, here's your deconstruction guide. This is what I can tell you makes this mythic cycle work. And here's where you see it in all of these different places around the world. The moment that I could sort of see it on the continent of Africa in stories that were coming from places that didn't even have centralized one centralized location, where there was like nomadic tribes going back and forth, where the stories were very specifically centered around what is it that we need to survive. Okay, well, there's a story for that. There's a story of a hero who doesn't understand how to search for water, and that becomes the entire center of the story. There's a story that deals with the tricksters out there, and that is maybe not such a small thing. Did I just lose audio? Hello? Am I on? I may have just lost audio. I'm so sorry if there's a pause. I'm going to wait for confirmation to know if I'm here or not, though.
You should be good to go.
Okay. I
Hey, everybody.
stuck in the middle and I saw that the stream got sort of disappeared.
Yeah, that was an error with the studio feline that caused a bit of a issue. So
Oh, super
yeah,
awesome. Well, as we're talking about a trickster, let's just say that the cats are always tricksters as well. So
it seemed very apt.
timing is everything. Good job. Good job.
All right, carry on.
Thank you.
Let me get out of your hair.
So yeah, so that's actually probably I think maybe one of the best examples. You don't know who to trust. Um, so let's carry on with this idea that once you see the once you see the idea that the hero's journey is everywhere, then you begin to basically see it everywhere. You see the deconstruction models working in all of these different ways. Okay. So, for the moment, let's say that even if you don't understand all of the aspects of the hero's journey, which we're going to just briefly touch on here in a minute, let's just say that you want to understand a little bit more of um, what sort of makes these ideas work. A while ago, and I think it was back in the 90s, there was a great book that basically talked about becoming a better screenwriter by using the hero's journey. That is, using deconstructing your script by washing it through the hero's journey. And to some degree, I think that that was useful, but I think it was widely misinterpreted. And as much as I loved how much exposure that was giving to the Joseph Campbell idea, I feel like it really circumvented what Joseph Campbell was trying to say, because he wasn't trying to say, hey, here's a template for storytellers to use. He was trying to say, hey, storytellers, this is what you see in mythic stories. Pay attention, because as you are telling your stories, you will know how to impart information to people. But it's not a like, okay, well, if you do A, B, C, D, and E, all of a sudden you will have the right story. Because of course, not everything can fit into that as neatly as that seems to uh that would appear to. And also that, there's always loose odds and ends. It's a big, enormous soup to try to pull things out of to make them make sense. Um, so okay, so let's just talk slightly about what it is basically that the hero's journey encompasses, and then we'll talk about some hero's journeys that exist in pop culture, that I like to use as kind of the models, and why they work so well. Um, so basically, you run into three sections of the hero's journey. It's the departure, it's the initiation, and then it is the return. Now, the departure is not just leaving the physical place, because maybe you don't actually leave a physical place. The departure is leaving the familiar behind. So sometimes you can be in your own hometown, your own home village. You never have left your little group, but you're leaving a familiarity of what you know behind in order to move into the next stage, which is initiation. This is when the hero basically is called, and it has accepted the world of the adventure. He is immersed in the unfamiliar. He's immersed with trials and tribulations, with temptations, with different conquests, with ideas that are foreign to him that he has to navigate, problems and puzzles and moralities, all kinds of things will end up being a part of the initiation. This is when we oftentimes, or what we oftentimes refer to as the hero enters the special world. And the special world can be anything. You can have a story about a a, a child who is experiencing for the first time their understanding of death, and their grandma is dying. If that's the case, the familiar world is a world that hasn't been touched by death. There hasn't been grief. There hasn't been the understanding that this is a part of the world. It's unfamiliar, it's untrodden ground. And that piece I think is really important because there there is this, I think, fascination with creating the special world as something that is more unique than it necessarily has to be. And I think sometimes we see this in horror too, where especially in horror movies, because horror movies tend to be a bit more on the fantasy side. Um, we see people sort of like taking leave of their senses. What we consider to be the thing that would happen is not necessarily the thing that's happening. Um, but it's an uninitiated world that they are in, so they have to be initiated into it in order to get to the next step, which is basically the return, where they come back to the familiar world with the knowledge that they have accumulated, and they're ready to process it. They're ready to assimilate it. They're ready to apply it now to the world that they know before they return on their next adventure. This cycle, and it is a cycle, is what oftentimes I think we sometimes think of as sort of like the beginning, the middle, and the end, but it kind of isn't. I mean, it is in one sense, but if you think of it in just the cyclic version, it sort of has a beginning, middle, and end only up until a very short point, at which time you are ready to engage again, or the material wasn't quite enough, so although you have been initiated into the special world, you need to actually go back to that world to gather more information, because even though the one thing that you needed on that trip you've gotten, you haven't gotten the complete understanding. The franchises that work really well with this sometimes in just pop culture are like the Hellraiser franchise has done a fairly good job with this. I mean, some of them are ridiculous, but they seem to like to include opportunistic lore. And I feel like that's because Clive Barker's understanding of a mythic journey was pretty complete. He did a really good job with this. But we also have stories like, or franchises like the Alien franchise, where each time we experience and engage with the aliens, we learn something a little bit different about their lore, about the entirety of not just who they are, but what our heroes need to survive for the next encounter. And each time you enter their world, or they enter our world, the material that you have learned gets stacked. And we see that pretty clearly with Alien and Aliens, where the things that Ripley has learned, she's able to give that information to the Marines. And then in Aliens, as they are trying to navigate what to do, they have a slight advantage. Now, it's not enough, and bad things happen, because the more that they understand about the aliens, sort of the more they need to go back and learn more. And I feel like that is actually a really good stacking understanding of the cyclic nature of the hero's journey. It never actually ends, but it does come to a slight conclusion, and then you're ready to go out again. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the idea of the hero himself. Uh, In in our modern day understanding of the quote unquote special, we love to create, and this was something I think that the Greeks and the Romans did really well as well with their gods, demigods, and their heroes, right? There was always something that was slightly miraculous about the hero's birth. The, the hero's birth was something of legend itself. Either he was or she was. Um, the circumstance of their birth was so unusual that it sort of created something of a scandal or a stir at the time. I love the idea of Achilles as this sort of archetype because Achilles, as an infant, his birth was not necessarily the stuff of legend, right? But what was the stuff of legend was what his mom did, which was dip him in the river Styx, and except for his heel, and because she was holding him by his heel, and she gave him kind of like immunity armor so that he couldn't be hurt. This idea, even though it feels silly, is sort of the exact well, I shouldn't say the exact opposite, but it is an opposite idea of the miraculous birth. You Something amazing can happen to our hero before they become the hero that signals that they are the one who needs to do this journey. They are the chosen one, right? And sometimes I think that in especially our modern day stories, we shy away from this part because we don't want to have our heroes be special. We want them to show that they are special. They have to rise up from nothingness. They can't have been given the keys to the kingdom before they get the kingdom. That would just be dishonest, and everybody else has to work. Why don't they have to work? This is a really interesting aspect, I think, of where our hero's journey idea has kind of taken a trip in a different direction, in a direction that I don't think necessarily is part of the mythic cycle. It's part of our cultural understanding of who we want as our heroes. And we'll get into that, but it's definitely a different. This is definitely a different part of it. Um, so as the hero is born or is somehow exposed to something amazing, a lot of our superheroes are suddenly thrust into greatness by the bite of a spider, or the exposure to gamma rays, or something that really heralds that something terrible and yet awesome is about to happen. And then it's now going to be up to them to either save the world, save their community, do something amazing. And that's where the hero's journey begins. As they start out in their quest, they enter the basic ordinary world. So we're exposed to what the ordinary world is. It's their hometown, it's their little slice of whatever is normal for them. The family, even if it's disrupted and chaotic, and it's normal for them. This is where they are, this is what their life is. So, don't get tripped up with the ordinary as being ordinary, like it's not appealing or it's just boring. It's not like that at all. It's just whatever is the baseline for the hero. As the hero begins to sort of move out of the ordinary world, they end up needing some information. And this information is generally what brings in the call to adventure. So they'll need to either be dissatisfied with what's happening in their world, that is, whatever is happening for them, they don't like it, or they want to change it. And sometimes they want to change it for reasons that are more nefarious. Sometimes they want to change it for reasons that are wholesome and, save the world, save the kingdom, do whatever they need to do to make stuff good. But sometimes they need to do something which I think is maybe where we sort of are moving in our own storytelling right now. And that is they have to journey into the wasteland. And as they journey into the wasteland, they take with them everything that was ordinary about them before, and they decide, oh, okay, uh I need to make the world a better place, or I've been chosen to make the world a better place, and therefore I have to do this quest. And then the quest becomes the hero's journey. If I could sort of break for a second and talk about a show that most people that I know have just concluded watching, The Last of Us, near and dear to my heart. This is actually one of the, I think, most interesting ideas of hero's journey, with the hero entering the wasteland, because Joel and Ellie, but Joel in particular is a really interesting hero who does refuse the call, doesn't want to engage in anything outside of his own sort of, I have my own mission, I have my own ideas. I don't necessarily want to save the world or feel called to save the world, and he ends up being talked into it. And as he's talked into it, his journey really begins by entering the wasteland. um that is a particular set of storytelling, I think, skills, or, well, yes, storytelling skills, but also storytelling parameters that we are super fascinated with right now, and I kind of like it. I feel like this is a good place for us to be, because I think that this is one of those times in history when we are seeing the world as being, um, very difficult to navigate and very hard to understand. And we find meaning in the simplicity of creating the wasteland, because this is how we get our information. Not everything is just good. We can't just have people out there that are experiencing the good stuff. We have to really accentuate how hard it is for people to survive, because that's how we feel. So we'll come back to the heroes. I mean, we'll come back to The Last of Us as a hero's journey idea in a later podcast, because it worked really well, and it did a great job of giving us a wholesome idea of story, which I will, both through the games and through the TV show, take with me for a long time. But let's go back to our hero's journey. So the hero is dissatisfied with whatever is going on in his world, and he wants to now change the world again, either nefariously or for, good wholesome experience. And he is basically called by an event or a person or an idea. And all of these things kind of, they can marry together, or they can be separate, or it can just be one of those kind of things. But the center is that the hero himself needs to have the idea that the world, that there's something that he can do or she can do that will change the way that things are right now. And so that call to adventure is, okay, I'm going to leave the world that I know behind, and I'm going to embark now on something completely different that I probably am not even prepared for. But okay, here I go. So there is sort of this leap of faith that the hero needs to take. And I do find, honestly, that we treat women and men in the hero's journey very differently. For women, the call to adventure is usually very subtle and usually involves saving family, or something that is, incredibly emotionally relevant to the woman. For men, it is more oftentimes than not, sometimes ideological, or someone has spurned them, and they feel like they have to change everything in order to make that spurn mean something. Looking at you, Spider-Man. Um, these kinds of ideas are definitely gender based, and I will 100% talk about that more in depth as we kind of move forward in our journey together here. But I just wanted to kind of point that out because it is, I don't think, any place more apparent that in storytelling, we don't treat women and men the same. And part of this, I think, goes back to the sort of Arthurian cycles where we got a really weird idea of chivalrous behavior. Because if we look, this is Western culture, because if we look at some of the Eastern cultures, women play a greater degree of there's both a normalcy for women in Eastern culture in storytelling, and there is a greater part for women to play, not just as mother, not just as crone, not just as some of the more basic understanding and ideas that we have in Western culture for women. Okay, so our hero is now being called off on his adventure, and usually the hero will have a moment, a pause where he stops or she stops and she says, I don't know if this is actually the right place for me to be in. I'm going to think about this, and I'm going to try to come up with a reason that I need to do this, or come up with a reason that I can walk away from it. Now, the refusal of the call, which is what this is called, is usually contained to, I guess, I mean, I can say that it's contained to older, storytelling, but I think that there's a reason for that. The reason that we don't have a lot of refusal of the call for us now is because of the way that we have evolved storytelling. Um, I think in the past, the refusal of the call was the hallmark that the hero was worthy, right? They had no hubris in the call itself. But now, we sort of recognize that any of us could be the special. And so the refusal of the call is less important because our sense of hubris is not actually an important aspect to either saying yes or moving away. We're worthy because we're who we are. We don't need to prove our worthiness by saying no, I'm not the one, or I could just walk away from this because hey, maybe you've got the wrong person, or like we don't assign the same kinds of qualities to the heroic person, to who the hero is, that we once did before. So I do think that that's important because we don't see it a lot right now. um but then once the hero has accepted, and there's a lot of different pieces that kind of go into the acceptance of the call. There's a lot of convoluted ideas that the hero can have in terms of how they figure out, no, yes, they absolutely have to participate. I don't know if you all have seen the movie called Bruce Almighty, but Bruce goes through this like really weird period where, God is saying, okay, well, you be God. And Bruce sort of comes up with a million reasons in his head why this sort of works or doesn't work. But the moment that he engages in it, he's kind of all in for the adventure. That's another one that's super interesting. Um, Okay, so after our hero is off on his own sort of journey, he's oftentimes given something to aid him. And this is another interesting one because storytelling today doesn't often give us the same kinds of ideas. We're no longer telling heroes' journeys or hero stories that where the gods play a huge role in the story. But in the past, that's really how it was set up and designed. The hero was aided or guided by something that was supernatural, whether it was a god or whether it was, some supernatural aid that was existing at the same time. The hero would either find it or be exposed to it. And this also, I think, is one of the sort of interesting ways that we are diverging now with our storytelling, where the the supernatural aid is often something that we can explain in science or have a good understanding of, yet it never touches us. Um, I just read a story that isn't, it's nothing yet, but I just read this sort of pre-screenplay idea about someone who experienced a temporal anomaly near the Hadron Collider. And it was really fascinating because, as the reader, what do we know of the Hadron Collider? But we know that it exists, and we can speculate all kinds of things around it, yet it's mechanical in nature. And because we can't explain it, it gives us all of these rich possibilities of stuff to talk about around it. So that's the kind of idea, is there's always something that is sort of supernatural. Even if we can explain it in science, it will feel like it is really amazing, super super special. Once the hero gets through that part, they do what's called cross the first threshold. The hero basically, like, makes a very willing move toward, okay, this is it, I'm committed, I'm moving. And then there is this idea, that is sort of, as the hero leaves his own world behind, um it's a bit like the death of that character's understanding of themselves. I don't want to say it's the death of their ego, because that's not what it is. It's the death of who they once were. That is the realization that once they step over this threshold, they can never go back. And that, I think, is definitely still a big part of our storytelling. I feel like this was one of the hallmark moments in Star Wars, where Luke realizes, after he sees what has happened to his farm, that there's no going back. He's committed now to the special world, to his call to adventure. There is no longer a reason for him to be where he is. And this is one of those, kind of interesting ideas where maybe the standard hero's journey that we would see wouldn't have him have that choice be taken from him, but it was like a conscious choice that he might make. But for Luke, it was, there wasn't anything left. And if we go backwards even one step and we think about what Luke's special aid was, Luke's special aid is the lightsaber. Now, it's a thing. It's not like anybody's going to go, "Oh, the lightsaber, that's got some kind of mythical purpose." I mean, later maybe, but at the time it wasn't like, "Oh, this is a some kind of religious piece of symbolism." No, it was a weapon. It was a thing, a legacy left over, but it was still his supernatural aid. Nobody else had them. It was very important. So yeah, that was just one of those sort of, by way of sort of explanation, what those supernatural aid pieces are. Okay, once your hero has experienced sort of the death of who they were, and what the expectations of what they were going to be are now changed, right? Because they are now moving into the realm of something brand new. Um, they enter into something called the Road of Trials. Now, the Road of Trials is really interesting. It's also called the Belly of the Whale. This is absolutely, I think, one of Joseph Campbell's strongest ideas. Um, Being in the belly of the whale is the biggest part of the story. It is the part of the story where your hero discovers the puzzles, the pieces that don't make sense, that he has to somehow make sense of. The things that hurt him, the things that that fill him with fear, that he then has to somehow be able to figure out in order to move into whatever the next phase is. Now, this, I think, is an important part to kind of stop at and say that the road of trials, or being in the belly of the whale, is oftentimes where everything gets churned up, and this is where I think things can get really difficult for storytellers to see that as they are telling their stories, each one of these aspects kind of can fit, but doesn't have to fit. You don't have your story, whatever your story is, if your hero is on a protracted journey and they don't have a supernatural aid, that doesn't mean that the story is not a hero's journey. It just means that the standard hero's journey gives the hero some kind of aid. Um, if your hero in the middle of the story is so incredibly turned upside down by the events of the story, you can absolutely see that there will that the natural repercussions of that will be that you have to bring your hero out of that in a slow and very careful way. And I think part of the reason that I pause here is because this is where I feel like, a lot of people choose to kind of create these crazy things for heroes to go through and then deus ex machina the entire thing, a blind of light, and everything is all back to normal. Well, that is really unsatisfying to the reader. And I think it kind of does a disservice to story in general because it doesn't give us the fulfilling aspect of, really having to be frustrated with the hero, really having to feel like there was work in this. Um, and maybe it's a false start, or maybe there's something else going on. But again, if we use the Star Wars example, at some point, Luke begins to realize that his story is complicated and that the resolution of his story is not going to be as simple as he thought it was going to be when he set out on the journey. So, his initial sort of, okay, well, in the belly of the whale is fighting the empire to, try to really get a good feel for what the empire is, I think, and then his own understanding of who he is. This, I think, is sort of the it's a quintessential understanding. Um and I'm struggling a little bit with this one because this is where I feel like we oftentimes we fail. But also where oftentimes we create an overly simplistic idea, and then the overly simplistic idea ends up being unfulfilling. So by the time that Star Wars ends, and Luke and Han and Chewbacca and R2D2 and everybody are getting their medals, and yay, things feel like, wow, okay, maybe things are going to be okay or whatever. Um Actually, it's not. This isn't. There's going to be something else that's going to be bigger that's going to happen here. Um, and there, I do feel like this is one of the few times when it would have been nice to actually leave things a little bit more chaotic so that the next experience could have picked up on some of that chaos. But I mean, that's just my opinion as it- understanding the story itself doesn't always make it satisfying, I think is the best way to say it. All right, so let's move into the next couple of phases. There's a lot more that goes into the hero's journey that is sort of like nuanced underneath some of the bigger things, but I'm going to sort of wrap it up a bit by going toward the refusal of the return. Um at some point the hero understands that their fight is so big, or that their quest is so big that are going to have a hard time being accepted either back, or that the information that they have acquired and gained tells them that there's so much more to do, that now they have to sort of stay on the quest. But that isn't the story. So the story has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. So the hero has to sort of come to their own place where they can refute the idea that they need to return. Um, when the hero does this, they usually leave a mark on the extraordinary world so that they can come back to it. And sometimes that's the defeat of their foe. Sometimes it's a little bit more subtle, though. Sometimes it's like, the hero has made a change in the extraordinary world just enough to carve out a spot for themselves there. And by doing so, they assure themselves and everyone else that they can return back to it. But generally, the refusal of the return um, is kind of like, either they are convinced that they can do more if they stay, or that their return to the ordinary world won't impact it. That that basically their journey was for naught, like deep self-doubt. And it's kind of interesting. That particular part is really interesting. um I sometimes think of this when I think of the movie Aliens again, where Ripley has to go back and save Newt. But I think even she recognizes that, even at that point, she recognizes that her return to the ordinary world is only going to be made whole by bringing Newt back with her. That returning to the ordinary world without Newt would be pointless and useless for her. That the world has to have meaning some other way. And so I feel like that is kind of a good example of what that sort of entails. Um, as the hero comes back, lots of other things can happen, including um, ideas that sort of center around how the hero returns themselves, or return themselves, what it is that they have brought with them that was of value to everyone else. And one of my favorite examples of this is in The Return of the King, which is the Lord of the Rings movies, the final of the trilogy. There's a scene where the hobbits are standing on the at the in Gondor as Aragorn is crowned king, and he comes over to them and they bow to him, and he says, "My friends, you bow to no one." And that is the moment that you realize that the hobbits have taken with them from the special world this prestige, but also a an amazing amount of respect from everyone else. This was their gift to the rest of the world, was so great that the rest of the world now bows to them. And yet, excuse me, as they come back to their world itself, they also then recognize that even though they have all of this prestige, even though they have all of this, all the accolades, the moment that they get back to their own original, here's my ordinary world, they don't fit. They, in fact, there's a great scene where they are at the pub, the tavern, and um they are sitting at a table all by themselves. They're not part of everyone else's conversation. They've been too changed by their adventure to be a part of that world the same way that they were before. It's going to take them a while to re-assimilate back in. And then usually the celebration is a last piece, and the celebration can be everything from something that's super happy to something that is bittersweet, something that has a flavor to it that says, you know I don't want to say happily ever after, because it's not happily ever after always, but it's that idea. It's the idea that whatever the quest was, the quest ended here. There is something to celebrate. Again, go back to Star Wars. There is medals being given out, or when the Awoks have their huge dance at the end of Return of the Jedi, or I'm sorry, Empire Strikes Back, or when you have this sort of like idea that all is right with the world again. Um, Even if all isn't right with the world, you still have that small moment where you feel like all is right with the world. This, I think, is a really important part of the story's end, where even if you're going to pick up and tell a new story out of this, you have to give people the chance to exhale and feel good about why the hero is on this journey in the first place. If there is never any success, if the hero never comes back and experiences some kind of under the broad definition, um of joy and celebration out of his return, then what was the point? And how will you get him to go back out again? Like, there's a lot of sort of important nuances to ending on, not, it doesn't have to end on a high note, but almost all mythic stories end on a, yeah, okay, we accomplished something. Something big has happened here. So there's a lot more to this, to the journey itself. There's a lot more nuanced pieces. There is magic flight. There's confrontations that happen with, as I mentioned before, threshold guardians. There's skills that the hero learns along the way that either thwart or bring him closer to understanding what his mission is. There's the stealing of the fire, which is generally, something that they take from the gods or whatever their supernatural thing that's happening at the time is, some way that you circumvent the power inside of your story, and then are able to use it in a way to affect some kind of change. Um, all of these things together make up the biggest part of the hero's journey. But again, as I was saying sort of at the beginning, understanding what the hero's journey is and feeling as if you can be connected to it is great, and I love it, because when I'm telling story, this is what I want my stories to encompass. They should have a little piece of all of these different elements, even if they're really small. I love it when they can, but I don't start out by saying, okay, my story has to have a crossing that brings my hero over the threshold. I have to have a story that has the refusal of the call, because wouldn't every good story? No, the story needs to flow from the artist. And only the artist, who is the writer, can possibly know what the protagonist needs to do or how they need to behave on their journey. And these things are important because, again, as we have sort of started to deconstruct what the hero's journey is, we also understand what the hero's journey is not. So the hero's journey is not just a template for telling stories. A hero's journey is a template that we can put over our stories to see, do they fit this way? Do they fit this way? What is happening in our stories? If we constrict our stories into very narrow hallways that specifically only bring us in one direction, then we will always have the same stories being told over and over again. And that is incredibly boring. And it's not really the way that I think our storytelling works. And our storytelling is continually evolving. Our storytelling is always trying to help us understand the world around us. And the hero's journey, I think, is just the place to start. It is certainly not the end of storytelling. And it is definitely not the hard coded piece of information that I think some people assign to it. It is just a way to parse information. At the beginning of this podcast, I started to talk about why I found Joseph Campbell to be so compelling. And the hero's journey is, of course, one piece that I did find very interesting. But more than that, Joseph Campbell has deconstructed the world of story and the mythic proportions of story over millennia of storytelling in a way, again, that makes sense in ordinary language, that doesn't parse it out using very academic jargon, and really puts it within reach of every person who reads his works. It is also incredibly uplifting in the sense that his idea of storytelling is, if you feel called to tell a story, then it is your job to tell that story. You would never tell an artist not to paint. You would never tell a- anybody who is a musician, don't play music. Artists create art. Story is 100% art. So if you are telling a story, be empowered to tell your story. If you want to see how your story lines up with mythic stories, with stories that tell great and epic quests that follow some of the biggest stories in our history, then of course take a look at the hero's journey and see how your story lines up. But please don't let the story itself become the journey that is just a template, because that's not the story. It's just a tool. Okay, I'm way over my time tonight, but I do want to say that, first of all, this has been really fun. Thank you so much for listening. The idea of the hero's journey is one of my most favorite topics to talk about. And I think that as I sort of go forward, there will be some callbacks to this because there's a lot that's happening in the hero's journey that I will be referencing as I kind of go forward. But there's also, I think, another piece to the hero's journey which was worth sort of dealing with and understanding on what passive and active storytelling kind of is, and how we're using it in the hero's journey model. Um, and that is that, for every great idea, it's still just an idea, right? Storytelling is dynamic, and how we tell stories is just as dynamic. It's filled with culture, it's filled with in the moment thinking, it's full of intellectual power that we place on the importance of words. It's filled with ideas that give us inspiration. It's all of those things, and each time we sort of understand an aspect and a different piece of the story itself, we understand ourselves better. And that is one of, I think, my favorite sort of takeaways from Joseph Campbell, is that the more that we understand story, the more we understand who we are as a people, as a culture, as a civilization, as human beings, because this is what we do. We tell stories. So next week, we're going to talk a bit about children's books. And I have some really interesting children's books that I want to kind of call attention to. And I wasn't going to talk about this, but I think I'm going to for next week too. We're going to talk a little bit about why some books lend themselves to being children's books more than others. That is why the call to adventure, if you will, that a lot of heroes in children's books have, why they are so successful, even when they're simplistic in their core, and how. we sort of tell those stories to kids to give them ideas that we want them to take with them for the rest of their lives. I'm also going to touch just a little bit on the trend of banning children's books and what I think about that, and why there is sort of a hue and cry right now for restricting books that kids have access to. I hope you'll join me for that, because that one I think is it's definitely part of our current sort of, where are we in the world. But as storytellers, I feel like this is so important. If we are going to have discussions about what it is that we are going to write, are we writing in a way that is, especially for kids, that is going to be seen by them? Are we writing because we need to just write it? Like, what are some of the ideas behind that? Is it okay to write anymore about, World War II and Holocaust survivors? Is it even okay to write a story that deals with slavery, or that deals with imperialism? What about, ideas that debunk some of the myths of history that we already know they don't fit? All of these ideas, I think, are important for us to at least discuss and make some sense out of, if we can. So next week, children's books. We're definitely going to talk about quite a few. And I've got a really cool book to read, which I think is a really good example of how children's books capture the attention of kids, and then what that says. I hope you'll join me for that. I hope you'll join me tomorrow when we finally are going to get through our 10 to 1 podcast. And it's completely been my fault. I'm so sorry. Life has been really super chaotic. But for our next 10 to 1 podcast, we are doing cars that play an essential part, or are actual plot characters in movies. And I've had this list together for a while, and I'm really excited to share it. And I'm really excited to see what my producer Josh, who's the co-host of 10 to 1, also came up with. And then we are going to do another special 10 to 1 right afterwards, or right, in succession, where we're going to talk about movies with problematic heroes at their center. People that are maybe like biopics, right? Not the people that we think that they were, but somehow in movies we make them a little bit better than they perhaps really were. Chris Columbus. There's a lot of really, really interesting ones. And, some of these actually made really good movies, even though it was they did not interpret history properly. Um, but they did make really good movies. So let's talk about why the movies were good, and kind of what that's all about. I'm really excited about that. If you want to find me, you can find me over at moviesandmeals.com. I just set up a brand new part of my blog to ask and answer questions about the podcast. I am really excited about that part. Please come over, ask me some questions, or just interact. I know that this is going to be a little bit slow in taking off, but the more emphasis that I can get over there, the better I can tailor the podcast to what people really would like to talk about in terms of story and how we interpret story. Okay, I hope that you have a great week. I hope you join us tomorrow. We'll see you soon.